I think to understand the book, it's also worth mentioning that the author of it may or may not have existed. So the author is referred to as Lao Tzu or Lao Zi, which directly translates to old philosopher or old master. So it's not actually a person's name, it's almost a pseudonym. So it could be multiple people, they could have never have existed, and this could have been a work of multiple people.
Yeah.
We just don't know. But it's traditionally credited to an individual. It might be a similar situation to Homer in the West, where it's such an old text that we don't really know whether they existed or not, whether it's a pseudonym. However, analysis of the linguistics and the rhyme structure seem to indicate that it was written around the 6th century BC, although there has been lots of debate about when this was actually originally written, and the estimates seem to range between the 3rd century BC and the 8th century BC, largely in the spring and autumn period of Chinese history. So it's worth mentioning what the actual purpose of the book was. Why did they bother writing it all the way back then? And I think that a historical perspective is the best one to lead with, because this period of Chinese history was a period of quite tumultuous warfare.
Okay.
There was lots of conflicts, and I think that there's lots of advice given to people like rulers in this book that makes you think that, well, this is intended as general advice to give people greater amounts of wisdom, but many of them are framed to give wisdom to rulers specifically. And I'm going to read a couple of the chapters. I'm going to go to chapter 66, which is perhaps one of the more explicit examples. So, the reason why the rivers and oceans are lords of the valleys and streams is because they occupy the lower position. This is why they can rule over them. For the same reason, an enlightened man who wishes to rule over people must, in his speech, take the humbler position. If he wishes to lead them, he takes his place behind them. In this way, although he is above them, he does not oppress them, and although he leads them, he does not lead them into harm. Thus the world delights in his rule and does not tire of it, because he is in conflict with no one, and no one cares to be in conflict with him. And that's actually one of the rare examples whereby it's quite clear what they're trying to say here, isn't it?
I have two things to say here. So one thing is that it seems to me that there is a commonality between ancient Western ethics or virtue ethics in the ancient West, Western world, and the Tao Te Ching. Yes. Because there is this focus on the person of practical wisdom, and practical wisdom is the trait that a wise ruler must have, or that a ruler must have. And it's all about how to rule. And it's interesting because if we look at this, there is a distinction between ancient approaches to ethics and Enlightenment approaches to ethics, because the action guidance is focused on what kind of person one must be, as opposed to what to do in specific cases.
Yes.
And I think that's a common theme.
Certainly, yeah. And I think it's actually quite a good approach to it, because I think that with specific circumstances, it garners specific types of responses, doesn't it? Yeah. And when you talk about general instances, or this is the way you should live your life in the abstract, when it's not grounded in practical circumstances, well, it can allow one without the proper grounding to go off into the weeds, and you can get things like Rousseau, who's got some pretty insane ideas about humanity and human nature that I feel could only be come up with by someone who's sat in a room full of books with no actual worldly experience.
And the second thing, which I think you will find very interesting, because it directly affects politics. The thing is, and I want to ask you about this, because it seems to me that it could be used as a tool for asserting authority without justifying it. Because if authority is to be justified in terms of in terms of a wisdom that is ineffable, and a wisdom that cannot be supported by reasons, that we cannot make a a case for it, but it's just we portray those who criticize us as unenlightened. Could it not be a dangerous tool in the hands of, let's say, politicians or those who have aspirations to rule? Because they could have a very metaphorical approach towards their thinking and speak in terms of metaphor. And every time someone tries to criticize them in terms of reasons, they would say, no, this is, you're unenlightened. The unenlightened person tries to speak about these things because the Tao is ineffable. Could that not be misused?
Well, I mean, any form of transcendental belief system can be misused in that way. I mean, you could use the example of the divine right of kings, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Whereby they could say, well, I'm the king, I am, whatever my will is God's will because I am the king.
Yes.
And so you could get a similar situation, but I feel like built into Taoism is the notion that your station doesn't necessarily dictate how enlightened you are or how far along the path you are. In that, in many ways, a man who has nothing is more of a Taoist than someone who is a ruler, because they are not burdened by worldly considerations necessarily. And we'll see those themes play out. But I think that what you raise there is still a valid concern, but I think that it's true of a lot of other things as well. It's not necessarily specific to this.
That's beyond doubt.
So it's also worth talking about some of the themes that are actually discussed here. So following the way of the Tao seems to be things like practicing humility, being non-violent where possible, valuing things that are simple, controlling and eliminating desires that seem superfluous, that are unnecessary. You should still have things like desires to have a family, to eat food, these sorts of desires, but desires for things like wealth and status, as it instructs, they come with their own problems, and you will still find yourself unfulfilled, which in a time of probably scarcity, that is quite a wise thing, because of course 6th century China it doesn't have the plenty that we have today, and people are still falling afoul of that lesson. It places a large significance on cultivating inner peace, and it's about tranquility, and we'll see that being perfectly level and balanced is certainly a theme, and it relates it to water in particular, which will be one of the things we'll talk about. And things like non-action, which it uses this term a lot, non-action being the path to the Tao, but non-action doesn't actually mean doing nothing necessarily. And what it's trying to do, I think, in talking about non-action, is that it's cautioning that sometimes the best solution is letting things play out as they will. And I think it's trying to mitigate the human tendency of whenever something goes wrong, for example, we always want to come up with a solution, whilst sometimes just leaving it and saying, okay, well, anything I do could potentially make this situation worse. There's a lot of wisdom there, particularly because it complements my political views in that whenever the government interferes, it makes something worse.
I think you raise many points here, and I have to separate the non-action part, which I'm not rejecting, but I haven't properly understood. Let's leave that aside for a moment. I think everything else you said shows a really healthy approach, I would say, to cultivating inner peace, because it says that focus first on your own affairs. Try to...
It's like Jordan Peterson, isn't it?
Clean
your room. That's the whole point of that, is clean your room before you face the world.
But tend to your soul as well. And try to fix your soul before you try to attempt to fix the whole of the world, the rest of the world. Yeah. And I think that this is there are some passages in the book that says that the most, I think the formulation was, the greatest general is the one who won himself. And I find that this is really important focus on self-mastery. Mm-hmm. And it's a really important thing. I really like the theme of self-mastery throughout the book, which gets me to the question of how does non-action relate to mastery? Because, I mean, if I approach it literally, non-action seems to me to be leading towards a kind of resignation.
I think,
but it doesn't seem to be that this is the message of the book. So how does this relate to self-mastery?
And I think that part of it might be a translation problem, because of course this is a very old Chinese book and it's translated into modern English, and I think that the large variance of translations, because I've read multiple different translations and some reorder the verses, some translate things to mean entirely different things, and it's not perfect. I'm going with the translation in this book, not necessarily because I feel like it's the best one, although I find it quite compelling. It's more so that the point of the book isn't necessarily to be understood literally. It's meant to be something that's thought-provoking. And even if the translation's a bit off here and there, you can figure out through the general themes of the book what the actual the literal translation was meant to be. But not only that, it's not the purpose for you to read it and just regurgitate or just embody it. You're meant to actually think about it and come to conclusions on your own. And I don't think that this main role of the book has been impeded by the fact that it's not necessarily been translated in a way that we would prefer.
Okay, so I think that's interesting, because I had an idea right now. Would you say that we could approach the text as being somehow art? Each chapter is like a painting, and by the author or the tradition of whoever was involved in sustaining the tradition of this book, sort of try to engage in a kind of moral or artful education of the readers, like in the same
way of putting it. Yeah,
in the same way that we could say that there are some kinds of music that we feel that they are purifying our soul. So would you say that this could make sense?
Well, I think they're trying to, with each verse, it's trying to take a snapshot of either a sort of intellectual disposition or an emotional one, about how you should either order your thinking or order your emotions. And it's not necessarily saying it in quite those terms, but it's alluding to certain dispositions that aren't necessarily as conscious as lots of the other topics that lots of other philosophers of the time would discuss.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.